Edmund Featherstone here, and I invite you to picture this: highly trained soldiers crouched behind sandbags, wiping sweat from their brows as their sworn enemy approaches, only for that enemy to be an army of enormous, bouncy, feathered birds with heads like periscopes and absolutely no respect for wheat fields or national pride. This really happened, and the nation behind it was not some tiny forgotten kingdom, but Australia in the year 1932. Before we march forward, do me a quiet favour. Tap like, subscribe, and in the comments, let me know what sort of bird you would most fear facing on the battlefield. Personally, I would find turkeys rather unsettling, but that is just me. The so-called Emu War was a display of both military determination and complete futility, proof that sometimes nature has no interest in respecting your chain of command. On paper it seemed like a trivial job, mobile guns versus slow, gawky birds. In reality, it became an escalating farce of soldiers chasing shadows through the Western Australian outback, while local farmers looked on with a mixture of desperation and disbelief. And, dear listener, the more the army tried to prove itself, the more the birds revealed an uncanny knack for turning the situation into something that looks suspiciously like slapstick comedy filmed in slow motion. To understand why trained soldiers ended up pointing belt-fed weapons at birds that looked like disgruntled dinosaurs, we need to set the stage. It was the early 1930s, and Australia had just finished sending thousands of young men to fight in the First World War. Many of them had come home, collected medals, and then, with startling humility, been told to please become wheat farmers. The government promised subsidies and support, though what they actually handed out was mostly dry fields, vague encouragement, and an annual plague of emus who arrived like clockwork the moment the crops were just tall enough to be desirable. Imagine cultivating a season of wheat under blistering sun, only to discover your greatest enemy lacks both complex language and any concern for your veteran status. The farmers were furious, the crops were vanishing, and the emus just kept striding about as if all of Western Australia was their personal buffet. Complaints piled up until the government looked at the situation, glanced at the army, and apparently concluded that nothing solves a bird problem quite like heavy weaponry. The logic was simple, though not exactly sound. If soldiers could endure trench warfare in Europe, surely a few feathery loafers would pose no challenge. Yet this was the fatal miscalculation. Because, as it turns out, warfare against emus has one tiny complication. You cannot negotiate with them, you cannot intimidate them, and even if you bribe them with breadcrumbs, they simply take the crumbs and invite several hundred new relatives. Western Australia in the early 1930s was vast, dry, and inconveniently full of birds. It was a land where the sky stretched wider than anyone's ambition, the roads were made of dust and regret, and the best-laid farming plans went enthusiastically unfulfilled. The federal government, still nursing the economic hangover from the Great Depression, had promised returned soldiers a stable life tending crops. But they neglected to mention that these crops would be defended from enormous birds in what amounted to an agricultural-themed fever dream. In this setting of sun-bleached isolation and mild despair, a curious triangle emerged: the struggling settlers, the indifferent government, and roughly 20,000 emus who refused to read the memos about wheat quotas. The agricultural scheme for veteran resettlement had been billed as both charitable and patriotic, which is what governments always say when they are distributing land no one else wants. The wheat belts of Western Australia looked promising on official maps, which failed to include details such as rocky soil, sporadic rain, or constant large non-paying avian guests. The subsidies, originally designed to support rural development, were already shrinking as the nation's economy did its slow-motion nosedive into despair. The policy of optimistic guessing, as one might call it, led hundreds of returned soldiers to settle on farms where half the topsoil had strong opinions about not staying in place. To make matters worse, the price of wheat was plummeting globally, meaning anyone lucky enough to produce a harvest could rarely afford to sell it. Enter the emus. Towering over most dogs and possessed of the blank, unbothered expression of a bird that has never paid rent in its life, the emu is native to Australia and has opinions about most fences, namely that they should be ignored. Every year around springtime, which in that climate mostly just means slightly less hot, these birds would descend from the inland scrublands in huge numbers. Newly motivated by maternal instinct and a complete lack of respect for property lines, they found the wheat fields particularly charming. The fields were conveniently flat, full of food, and often contained water tanks built carefully by humans for the comfort of their feathered invaders. For the emus, it was as if someone had arranged a resort vacation and then courteously left town. The damage they caused was not minor. The emus stomped crops, knocked down fencing, and occasionally left behind the deflated morale of a fully grown man holding a hoe in one hand and a bundle of unpaid bills in the other. Fences meant to keep rabbits out became the equivalent of polite suggestions to the emus, who simply tromped over or through them, often in organized clusters that seemed suspiciously aware of weak spots. Reports came in of breakaway herds numbering in the hundreds, coordinating their movements in ways that suggested either evolutionary cunning or, more likely, a shared enthusiasm for destroying wheat. Predictably, the farmers appealed to the government. Less predictably, the government listened. Of course, listening in this case meant convening several men in stiff uniforms to decide how best to apply combat strategy to a problem involving birds. The result was a decision both fascinating and faintly ridiculous. A small detachment of military personnel would be dispatched to the region, not to build better fences or to study the migration patterns of emus, but to shoot them, a lot, with machine guns. The plan, such as it was, leaned heavily on optimism and a rather impressive overestimation of human superiority. It was to be a quick operation, an extermination effort justified in memos with phrases like pest control and rural aid, though one imagines internal conversations included the phrase, "Absolutely not a war, please do not tell the press." They selected Major G.P.W. Meredith to lead the operation, which is exactly the sort of name that screams underfunded military drama. He arrived in Campion, one of the hardest-hit regions, with a pair of Lewis guns, several thousand rounds of ammunition, and a handful of men who had signed up for military service, not what was rapidly becoming a slapstick episode of Looney Tunes. The Lewis gun, for context, had been used effectively in the trenches of France. It was large, robust, and deeply unsuited for targeting birds that travelled in unpredictable packs and could sprint at speeds up to 30 miles per hour. The idea of turning this weapon upon emus sounded like a decisive solution in theory. In practice, it was more of a woodland farce. The first encounter set the tone. A flock of emus appeared in the distance, perfect targets by the standards of command. The soldiers crept into position, aimed the heavy machine gun, and discovered that emus do not respectfully stand still when enemy fire begins. Instead, they scattered in all directions, ducking behind shrubs, diving into dry creek beds, and zigzagging with the agility of greyhounds. The gun jammed within moments. The emus, learning absolutely nothing from their brush with death, regrouped a few hundred yards away and continued eating. It was the beginning of what would be several weeks of determined, if largely ineffective, pursuit, and so the stage was fully set. You had the veterans, promised security, and handed chaos. The government, applying late colonial logic to a situation that called more for agronomy than artillery. And the emus, not aggressive, not particularly vengeful, just very large birds with limited respect for national borders or monoculture farming. Between them all rose a conflict that was somehow both deeply absurd and hauntingly symbolic. Britain's military legacy, repurposed as bird control, rural despair met with jokes from the tabloids, and a nation forced to reckon with the age-old truth. Sometimes your most formidable opponent does not come from across the sea, but from your own outback, carrying feathers and the unshakable confidence of an apex seed thief. The newspapers caught wind of the operation almost immediately, because nothing delights a bored public during economic collapse quite like the notion of soldiers losing a war to birds. Headlines crept into print with increasing disbelief. Articles speculated on the enemy's tactics, the emu's strategic flocking, their uncanny ability to vanish behind low shrubbery, and their apparent immunity to dignity-destroying headlines. It was a conflict that began as problem-solving and quickly became performance art. And as the weeks went on, the troops would find themselves adjusting strategies, chasing shadows, and occasionally being outmaneuvered by birds who could neither read maps nor pronounce the word military. By the end of the first week, it was becoming clear that this was not a skirmish. It was a siege, not of territory, but of logic itself, and the emus were winning, calmly, relentlessly, and always with that same blank-eyed expression. By the second week of operations, morale among the soldiers had shifted from mildly hopeful to clinically resigned. The mission's official name remained classified, but in private correspondence it was increasingly referred to as that ghastly bird situation. Major Meredith, whose brow had already begun to develop a permanent furrow, requested additional trucks, not for mobility or supplies, but to replace the first one, which had suffered the indignity of overheating while trying to chase a bird uphill. The emu in question had not only escaped, but had paused at the top of the ridge, turned around, and stared, just long enough to suggest condescension. To improve their odds, the unit experimented with different tactics, none of which could strictly be described as effective. One attempt involved hiding in wait by a watering hole, only for the emus to ignore the trap entirely and visit a different watering hole 30 feet away. Another involved firing from a moving vehicle, which worked for 7 seconds before the recoil of the Lewis gun caused the truck to lurch sideways and hit a fence post. No one was harmed, unless one counts dignity. The emus, meanwhile, maintained their policy of enthusiastic disinterest. Back in Perth, government officials received increasingly surreal field reports. Casualty figures remained low, but only for the soldiers. The number of confirmed avian neutralizations was, at best, debatable. One report optimistically claimed over 200 kills. Upon actual inspection, it became apparent that some of those may have been recounted birds who simply looked similar. Emus, it turns out, are hard to tell apart when you're deeply dehydrated and morally defeated. It was around this point that Major Meredith requested a more systematic approach to classification. Unfortunately, nobody had thought to design a proper field log for bird warfare. An enterprising corporal named Thomas drafted a chart of emu silhouettes, complete with checkboxes labelled wounded, evaded, and probably imagined. This system failed to improve outcomes, but did provide several hours of bureaucratic comfort. Thomas went on to be promoted for entirely unrelated reasons. The birds themselves began to develop a mythology among the troops. One especially tall emu with a distinctive limp, allegedly from a glancing bullet wound, was nicknamed Sergeant Swoop. Despite missing part of a crest feather and having what soldiers called an unforgivably smug gait, Sergeant Swoop was spotted over a dozen times leading different flocks. Whether it was the same bird or merely a recurring symbol of avian triumph is unclear. What is known is that any time Sergeant Swoop appeared, the guns jammed. Back at the ministry, pressure mounted for clarification. Parliamentarians who had greenlit the operation under the impression that it would be over in a week were now being questioned by constituents holding newspapers with headlines like "War Feathered and Lost." A junior minister suggested turning the whole thing into a scientific study. A senior minister politely asked him to stop speaking in public. Despite internal chaos, the official message remained that progress was being made. Exactly what kind of progress, no one seemed ready to define. Meanwhile, local farmers were of two minds. Some were grateful for the effort, bringing out tepid tea and homemade biscuits for the soldiers and refraining from questions like, "Did you hit anything today?" Others were less polite. In one instance, a farmer waved a rusted rake in the air and declared he'd seen pigeons with better tactical discipline. He was later fined for obstructing a federal operation, although the record rather delicately avoided describing how. By week 3, the Lewis guns required more maintenance than a Victorian lawnmower. The barrels overheated easily, the drum magazines stuck, and one was dropped accidentally in a creek by a private who later claimed it had sprung a leak. For morale's sake, the claim was accepted without question. Meredith requested mortars. This was denied, possibly as a result of a classified memo titled, "What if we miss?" At least one civilian group attempted to capitalize on the situation. A local theatre company staged an interpretive dance called Flightless but Free, which depicted the struggle from the emu's perspective. The performance involved heavy drumming, one performer in a papier-mâché bird head, and a finale in which a mock Lewis gun was disassembled and repurposed as a bird feeder. The critics were unmoved. The emus were not available for comment. Perhaps the final indignity came when a group of emus outran a mounted patrol. Horses, as a rule, are faster than birds, but the terrain was rocky, the birds were determined, and the riders were unfamiliar with the art of turning corners without sliding dramatically into bushes. One horse was slightly injured, the bird was not. This prompted a report titled "Contingency Planning for Outmanoeuvred Cavalry," which now resides in Australia's National Archives under the subject heading Miscellaneous. With ammunition supplies dwindling and the cost-to-kill ratio now in the realm of performance satire, a reluctant withdrawal was proposed. The operation would be scaled back, not ended, merely re-evaluated for efficiencies. This is, of course, the language bureaucrats use when saying that something has failed, but would like not to be formally blamed for it. The withdrawal itself was uneventful, except for one last moment of symbolism. As the trucks prepared to leave Campion, a small flock of emus approached the dirt road. They paused near the edge, looked at the departing convoy, and then wandered across without urgency. One soldier, reportedly, offered a slow salute. It was unclear whether it was meant respectfully or sarcastically. History has not recorded the answer, and so Australia's brief, surreal war with its unofficial bird population entered its next phase, the part where no one wanted to talk about it, but everyone quietly agreed it had happened. The emus returned to their scrublands, the soldiers returned to more terrestrial duties, and the farmers returned to wondering if the rabbits had perhaps been a more manageable problem after all. Of course, not everyone gave up. Plans were already underway for a second attempt. More strategic, more efficient, just a little more desperate. The emus, presumably, remained unimpressed. After the dust settled from the first failed skirmish, the human side retreated, not in disgrace exactly, but in the sort of confused silence that follows when reality refuses to cooperate with expectations. The emus returned to their usual routines of trampling crops, startling goats, and emitting guttural warbles that sounded vaguely sarcastic. Farmers watched from their verandas with arms crossed and expressions that blended awe with mild despair. The soldiers, meanwhile, regrouped at a nearby base that had, until then, mostly been used to store broken farming equipment and one deeply haunted lawnmower. Major Meredith, the officer tasked with leading the campaign, spent a quiet afternoon drawing up new plans by candlelight, assisted only by a pot of extremely bitter tea, and a corporal who insisted on calling each bird Gregory, regardless of gender. This detail did not help morale. The new plan leaned heavily on timing. It was decided that the army would lie in wait at one of the emu's known watering holes, from which the birds could reliably be expected to emerge at dusk for their evening bout of menacing the countryside. The hope was that surprise, rather than firepower, would win the day. Unfortunately, the watering hole strategy assumed a level of punctuality in emus that they simply did not possess, leading to soldiers spending hours hidden behind shrubs, growing increasingly sunburned and mildly poetic. By the fourth day in the bush, the men had started giving each other honorary bird rankings. Private McAllister was now Lieutenant Featherboots. Sergeant Collins responded only to the name Screaming Beak. Someone tried to salute a passing pelican just in case. Morale did not improve, but it did start to shift into surreal territory. When the emus finally appeared, they arrived in a formation that no one could quite describe without sounding ridiculous. Witnesses recalled they came in 3 loosely structured columns, spread across the horizon like a bizarre feathered pincer movement. There was no evidence they were coordinating, but also no reason to believe they were not. One soldier compared it to watching a school play put on entirely by geese, but with better choreography. This time the troops were ready. The machine guns had been checked, rechecked, and had been cleared of the inexplicable amount of dust and mothballs that had plagued the first attempt. But as the men opened fire, the same problems re-emerged. The birds scattered impossibly fast, darting in every direction at once like synchronized chaos. A young artilleryman fired at what he swore was a massive emu, only to discover it was a scarecrow in a particularly convincing hat. By the end of the skirmish, official tally reports noted that over 900 rounds had been fired. Estimated casualties: 12 emus and 1 wheelbarrow. The newspaper headlines practically wrote themselves. Back in Perth, government officials struggled to understand how exactly the birds were winning. One minister suggested the birds might be descended from velociraptors, while another floated the idea of importing hawks from Canada. A third briefly tried to declare the emus a protected species, just to see if that would confuse them into stopping. It did not. As October faded into November, the birds grew emboldened. Herds, flocks, whatever one calls a group of emus, began to appear closer and closer to town limits. In one memorable incident, an emu wandered into the post office of a small town called Woobin and stood perfectly still for 40 minutes next to the sorting desk. It was never entirely clear what its intentions were, but postal operations were halted and 3 letters were misdelivered, a local scandal from which the town has never fully recovered. Adding to the confusion, word of the emu resistance began to spread beyond national borders. British newspapers picked up the story, running it next to lighter pieces about marmalade shortages and aristocratic poodles. One London editorial suggested that perhaps Australia was being punished for its climate choices, or that the birds were enraged descendants of those who had seen too many boomerangs thrown in vain. In a final attempt to shift momentum, the Defence Minister authorised a new tactic: mounted pursuit units. These consisted of soldiers on horseback attempting to chase the emus across the dry outback, firing as they rode. The plan, while cinematic in theory, was less so in execution. The emus, unhindered by concepts like pride or saddle sores, simply ran faster. One bird reportedly reached speeds exceeding 40 miles per hour, or what the Australian military officially categorised as unreasonably quick. Perhaps the most desperate moment came when a team was assembled to capture an emu alive for study. Their logic was simple: learn their secrets, discover their weaknesses, possibly bribe one into becoming an informant. The expedition was led by a zoologist named Hector Grimshaw, who wore thick spectacles and a pith helmet that had been passed down through 3 generations of mildly confused botanists. He believed, with great sincerity, that the emus could be reasoned with if only they were listened to properly. Grimshaw's team managed to corner one emu near a silo, surrounding it with nets, crates, and an increasing number of written apologies. But the bird, with what can only be described as strategic apathy, simply sat down and refused to move. After 12 hours, the team conceded defeat and elevated the emu to Honorary Associate of Natural Sciences. They named it Clement and released it with full academic honours. Meanwhile, the farmers continued their struggle. Many found themselves installing makeshift barricades, using piles of decaying encyclopedias and empty tinned peaches. The birds, it turned out, were largely immune to both literature and pantry stockpile strategies. Children reportedly began using emu silhouettes as target practice with slingshots, while one particularly ambitious farmer tried to train his sheepdog to bark in Morse code. The result was unintelligible, but considered an improvement over silence. As the rains finally came and harvest season approached its muddy end, the calls for military withdrawal grew louder. The operation, once portrayed as a noble defense of agricultural dignity, had become something far stranger, a campaign haunted equally by feathers and farce. The official recommendation became clear: let the emus be, and focus instead on repairing fences with less confidence and more wire. Still, late at night, some said you could hear them, the emus, drumming across the fields, their footsteps sounding like misplaced thunder, their beady eyes reflecting the moon in unsettling semaphore. But that, as always, may have been the wind playing tricks with broken field glasses, and the sighs of men who once believed a machine gun could outwit a bird. Retreat in most martial traditions is a solemn affair. In this case it involved a brigadier general quietly climbing back into his truck, while an emu stared at him with what can only be described as mild disdain. Major G.P.W. Meredith, the man in charge of this ornithological ordeal, reported back to command that, in his expert estimation, the birds were too fast, too numerous, and, perplexingly, too coordinated. He used phrases like highly mobile flocks and erratic tactical behavior, which sounded impressive until you remembered he was talking about emus whose general decision-making process involved running in a straight line until something exploded. After the official withdrawal, the birds resumed control of the terrain. Emu veterans of the conflict strutted across fallow fields like grizzled generals of feather and sinew. Western Australia, already sceptical of the federal government on its best day, now had another item on its growing list of grievances. Not only had the Commonwealth failed to protect their crops, it had organised a full-scale military failure with a body count that included exactly 0 emus and several bruised egos. One account mentioned a soldier twisting his ankle while attempting to bayonet a bird that, with sublime indifference, simply walked away. Determined not to be outwitted by creatures with no discernible facial expressions, the government moved to phase 2 of its anti-emu efforts, bureaucracy. They proposed a national bounty system. Farmers would receive payment for every emu they eliminated, provided they could produce physical evidence, usually a pair of emu legs. It wasn't elegant, but it did achieve the twin bureaucratic goals of appearing productive and mildly horrifying. Within weeks, ambitious individuals began presenting bundles of large, scaly limbs to government depots, sometimes still warm, sometimes accompanied by a suspiciously self-satisfied grin. One man, known locally only as Cyril the Leg Merchant, found great success. No one knew if he actually hunted emus or simply had a deal with someone who did, but he became something of a legend all the same. He arrived each Thursday in a battered cart filled with pale grey legs, bundled like damp umbrellas. People stopped asking questions around the 8th week. Cyril claimed to have a technique based on the bird's dislike of accordions, though no one ever found the courage to test this directly. Meanwhile, the emu population did not seem to notice. Their numbers continued to rise. Scientists proposed a number of theories, most of them incorrect, including one confident suggestion that emus could detect machine oil and had developed an aversion to industrial machinery. Another hypothesized that the birds were protecting something, a cache of eggs perhaps, or a hidden shrine. The Royal Ornithological Society declined to comment, though one junior researcher was later found trying to interview an emu using a pair of glasses glued to a melon. The bird ignored him, which, in the grand scheme of things, was its most consistent response to human inquiry. In desperation, local authorities lobbied for aerial support. Someone in Perth drew up a plan involving small biplanes, large nets, and for reasons not fully explained, lemons. The lemon aspect was apparently inspired by a French pamphlet about bird repellent used in vineyard protection, although the same pamphlet also recommended whispering polite threats at crows, so its scientific value was debated. No planes were ever dispatched, partly due to funding, and partly because the Air Force claimed all available pilots had pressing engagements or feared retribution from the birds. Instead, attention turned to deterrence. Over the next year, farmers along the wheat belt erected ever more elaborate fences, scarecrows and noisemakers, none of which worked. One innovative farmer built a rusted iron effigy of a fox wielding a musket, complete with a tin hat and a sign reading, "Be gone, flightless ones." It was respected by a single kestrel, which roosted on the musket's barrel for 3 weeks before migrating. The emus, meanwhile, walked through the fields in phalanxes of 5 or 6, munching grain with confident aplomb. Throughout all this, international papers caught wind of the situation. The Times of London dispatched a correspondent who described the Australian government's efforts as a desperate dance between embarrassment and futility. The New York Herald ran a cartoon showing Australia as a gentleman in pith helmet being mugged by a large bird with pockets full of wheat. Even the Soviets published a notice, although theirs focused on the decadence of capitalist birds and included a line drawing of Lenin chasing hens with purpose. Back home, the Great Emu War, as it was now widely called without any apparent sarcasm, entered the realm of folk legend. Bars began serving emu punch, a mixture of grain alcohol and something ambiguously described as citrus essence. Folks sang modified bush ballads about the feathered insurgents. One widely sung verse went simply, "The emu don't fly, but she sure knows the land, and she'll nick all your barley while you're stuck in the sand." Children in Perth held backyard reenactments involving brooms, pillowcases, and the occasional brave Labrador. Toy companies cautiously floated the idea of a commemorative play set involving an emu fortress and a tiny major with a bewildered expression moulded into his plastic features. Sales projections were promising, but the distribution licenses grew tangled in something called the Agricultural Morality Clause, which was mostly taken seriously by people wearing very serious hats. By late 1933, the emu problem was considered less of a crisis and more of a chronic condition, like hay fever or badly translated signage. The military declined to return to the region, citing logistical challenges, budget limitations, and an institutional reluctance to be laughed at again. The emus continued their cyclical migrations, pausing only long enough to ruin entire harvests and stare blankly at anyone who yelled at them. It was a slow, constant indignity, made worse by the birds' total failure to gloat. Their victory was thorough, but without triumphalism, which in a way made it worse. Then came the botanists. A university team proposed studying the emu's digestive patterns, hoping to determine why they preferred certain crops over others. They deployed a group of undergraduates carrying notebooks, field goggles, and an excessive number of pencils. Most came back with little more than frowns and sunburns, but one returned with a small chart he claimed proved emus operated on a 26-day foraging cycle tied to lunar phases and wind direction. This theory was later adapted into a folk calendar used by a small community of wheat growers who claimed to have finally made peace with the birds. Their peace offerings included cucumbers, jazz records, and a yearly dance called the Great Flap, which ended in participants lying still on the ground and accepting fate. And so the war dwindled not with a bang, nor even with a bureaucratic memo, but with mild confusion and reluctant coexistence. Emus strolled through open pastures like minor nobility, and the soldiers who remembered the campaign rarely spoke of it without a far-off look and a muttered reference to the day the gun jammed again near Woodina. Most of the machine guns were quietly reassigned to less humiliating tasks, like pretending to guard a grain silo. But somewhere in the red dust of Western Australia, you can still find fences bent in peculiar angles, tracks that lead nowhere fast, and occasionally on the wind the distant sound of something large and feathered not particularly caring what you think. But just as peace seemed to flutter gently back over the scrublands, like a misplaced tea towel on a clothesline, trouble stirred once more in the wheat-choked paddocks of Western Australia. The emus, having tasted military success and the intoxicating freedom of grain theft, returned in even greater numbers. It seems that word of human incompetence travels fast in the bird world. Local farmers reported sightings of emu groups displaying what could only be described as organized behavior, taking shifts, assigning lookout birds, and in one deeply unsettling case, forming a near circle around a rusted tractor as though holding some sort of feathered court. The government, no longer content with embarrassment shared only within the nation's borders, decided to escalate the situation in a way only bureaucracies can. They introduced Major Meredith's second expedition, this time armed with not one but 2 machine guns, a surveyor's map of uncertain accuracy, and a sergeant with a chronic fear of feathers. Predictably, the emus adapted. Where once they scattered like unruly confetti, they now employed flanking manoeuvres and performed diversion tactics, possibly borrowed from children's books on cavalry warfare. According to reports that were never officially denied, one particularly large emu was seen decoying soldiers toward a dry creek bed before disappearing like a magician's assistant with surprisingly powerful thighs. Meanwhile, in Canberra, politicians attempted to spin the ordeal by invoking agricultural defence rhetoric. Wartime posters were designed, but they were quickly shelved after focus groups found them insufficiently intimidating and mostly birds. The Minister for Defence, when pressed by Parliament on the rising cost of ammunition per confirmed bird, deflected by pointing out that the programme had at least improved regional morale, which it had in a backward sort of way. Children across the outback began playing new games like Feign Barry the Emu and Duck Duck Soldier, neither of which had clear rules, but both involved a lot of chaotic flapping. Things reached an unexpected turning point when Hubert Gray, a tall, sunburned farmer, known mostly for once accidentally inventing a fence entirely out of bicycle frames, attempted what he called a diplomatic approach. Donning a formal jacket and a bowler hat he borrowed from his cousin's wedding, he marched into the open field with a sack of wheat and a bell. He stood in silence. Not one emu approached. Onlookers described the birds as collectively gazing at him with an expression that can only be described as long-suffering disdain. After 12 minutes, Hubert gave a speech about agricultural unity that he had prepared on a cereal box. The emus were unmoved. They did, however, trample his bell. Elsewhere, a rogue element emerged in the form of the Farmers' Auxiliary Bird Brigade, a volunteer militia composed entirely of ageing sheep shearers, tax-averse hobbyists, and one very confused dentist. Armed with 12-gauge shotguns, mosquito netting, and an unsettling sense of purpose, they laid traps that looked more like elaborate picnic setups gone horribly wrong. Very few emus were caught, but the brigade did manage to ensnare a local surveyor, a travelling accordion salesman, and at one point their own brigade leader, who spent 3 hours arguing with a fence post he believed to be a traitor. By mid-December, the emus appeared emboldened. In one incident known locally as the Gullah Hill Standoff, a splinter group of particularly athletic birds occupied a raised ridge and deflected attempts at removal simply by running sideways in a zigzag while mocking soldiers with low croaking sounds that resembled laughter. The soldiers tried to fire upwards, but the trajectory proved uncooperative and the machine gun jammed, possibly overwhelmed by the existential pointlessness of it all. This seems like a good time to mention that Australia had, at that time, precisely 0 military protocols for what to do when outsmarted by birds. No field manuals, no tactical diagrams, not even a folding chart of common avian weaknesses. One military advisor suggested deploying kites shaped like wedge-tailed eagles, a natural emu predator. Unfortunately, emus proved unbothered by fabric and string, and in one incident directly attacked a hobbyist kite-flying club during a charity picnic. The emus won a fruitcake and several unopened tins of condensed milk. As December wore on and the temperatures climbed, the war, or skirmish, or theatrical farce, descended into legend. Larrikins down at the pub reenacted key battles with brooms and umbrellas, while elderly ladies crocheted hand towels featuring emus pecking at bayonets. The Royal Australian Mint briefly considered commemorative coins, but scrapped the idea after their designer drew an emu holding a sabre. The coin was later released anyway, quietly, under the title 1977 Bicentennial Wildlife Series. You will find the bird has a strangely knowing expression. Desperate for solutions that did not involve further diplomatic humiliation, the government considered offering the birds a nature reserve which, ironically, they had already taken for themselves 10 years earlier. One enterprising minister floated the idea of constructive integration, which turned out to mean tricking the emus into pulling carts. A test program in Carnamah lasted approximately 6 minutes before the emus bolted, dragging the carts for 4 miles and accidentally initiating the town's first unscheduled parade. All the while the emus continued their rampage, not out of malice, but simply because it suited them. Wheat was tasty, heat was tolerable, and their opponents seemed incapable of learning. They were not just birds anymore. They were survivors, champions, the long-legged inheritors of an unresolved epoch. Children began leaving out small offerings, like crusts of bread and shiny buttons, hoping to appease the great birds and avoid the fate of old Barnaby the goosekeeper, whose standoff with 6 emus ended with the total loss of his trousers and a mild concussion. At this point, it is also important to remember that all of this occurred while the nation was still in the grip of the Great Depression. Funds were scarce, tempers were short, and there were more pressing concerns. Yet the War of the Emus had become a kind of strange national theatre. It was as though Australia, caught between economic despair and a vast empty continent, had decided to channel its anxiety into an entirely symbolic, entirely feathered enemy. One farmer described it best after his barn roof was commandeered by a vigilant pair of emus who enjoyed the view. "We lost the war, but I think we gained a sort of spiritual livestock." By the end of the campaign, official estimates of emus killed ranged from trivial to barely worth mentioning. Casualties on the human side, dignity, sanity and boots, were immense. The military quietly packed up their equipment, filed their final reports in a drawer marked "to be reconsidered," and collectively agreed never to bring it up again. The emus, for their part, spread out, migrated, and eventually moved on, except for one, an elderly bird affectionately nicknamed Sergeant Peck, who continued to patrol the abandoned rifle range for several years, muttering to himself in low grunts and occasionally stealing tobacco from unattended saddlebags. And so the great Emu War reached its surreal climax, not with a final battle or triumphant speech, but with quiet, flustered retreat, and the faint sound of bird calls echoing through the spinifex. Somewhere across the hot, thistle-packed grasslands, the victors wandered free of medals, unconcerned by headlines, and forever undefeated by something as mundane as logic. Among the first visible consequences of this absurd defeat was a sudden surge in public support for the emus. Not organised support, mind you. There was no emu party or feathered lobby group, but a quiet, growing fondness that settled over the population like the dust storms of the western plains. Children began drawing emus in their school books. Local poets wrote short odes with titles like "O Feathered Friend, So Fleet and Free." One farmer outside Merredin claimed an emu saved his life by startling him away from a collapsing well. It did not make any sense, but very little about this war ever did. Meanwhile, within the hallowed halls of government, awkward conversations brewed like oversteeped tea. The Minister for Defence was said to have refused to say the word emu for the rest of the year, referring instead to those avian insurgents. Reports circled that someone in the Department of Agriculture had proposed domesticating the emus to use them as border patrol animals, citing their intimidating height and natural mistrust of fences. A committee was formed. It met once, then never again. Back in the wheat belt, farmers witnessed the reappearance of a different kind of invader, travelling journalists. Foreign correspondents arrived from as far afield as London and New York, wearing three-piece suits and expressions of suppressed confusion. They interviewed battle-weary soldiers who tried, unsuccessfully, to maintain their dignity while explaining how a bird with legs longer than their rifles had outrun a truck. One photojournalist captured a remarkable image of an emu attacking its reflection in a military-issued shaving mirror. The photo won an award. Amid the embarrassment, a small cult of personality formed around Major G.P.W. Meredith, the officer who had commanded the Emu War Task Force. He was a man of decent aim and even better moustache, known locally for having once stared down a kangaroo until it hopped away in what might have been shame. After the war, he returned to regular military duties, though local children often asked him to autograph feathers. He obliged. He never clarified where the feathers came from. The chaos quietly bled into the economy in its own peculiar way. While the government refused to acknowledge any official emu-related compensation fund, one enterprising accountant discovered a loophole that allowed farmers to declare injury to morale as a tax deduction. By the end of the fiscal year, nearly 17% of Western Australia listed egregious bird interference under miscellaneous losses. Down in Perth, urban Australians began hearing whispers of the war and assuming it was some kind of regional pantomime, like folk theatre with feathers. Souvenir shops started selling decorative bayonets with silhouettes of emus on the handles. One particularly ambitious merchant began crafting plush emus in military helmets, though supply ran out after only 6 were made, as that was the total number of available buttons in town. In the town of Kellerberrin, a competition arose among farmers to build the most emu-proof fence. What began with wooden slats and wire quickly escalated into barbed designs worthy of medieval siege defence. One man constructed a sliding gate that played a gramophone recording of a rifle cocking each time it opened. It did not work. The emus walked right through, occasionally pausing to peck at the phonograph horn. As the months passed and wheat continued to go missing under suspiciously 3-toed footprints, new alliances quietly unfolded. Some farmers began leaving out scraps for the emus, attempting to tame them. They named them things like Gregory or Susan. These efforts mostly failed. The emus remained standoffish, as if vaguely aware of the homicides attempted upon them with belt-fed ammunition. But in one instance, an emu reportedly allowed a farmer to briefly touch its neck. That farmer later wrote a memoir. It sold 19 copies. At the edge of this absurdity hovered a man named Clive Argall, a dairy farmer who had received exactly one news clipping about the emu war and assumed after some whiskey that it was an elaborate metaphor. Upon realizing it was quite literal, he founded the first unofficial Emu Appreciation Society. Membership consisted entirely of Clive and his sheepdog, Percy, who was not enthusiastic. They held meetings every Tuesday. Clive wore a tie. By late 1933, the Department of Defense quietly issued a moratorium on avian combat operations. This did not stop one particularly eager lieutenant from proposing a new aerial offensive using trained hawks. The plan was rejected before he finished his sentence. Instead, the government decided the most cost-effective measure was fencing. Long, boring, functional fencing, paid for half-heartedly through regional grants, with the unfortunate consequence of causing emus to gather at specific fence corridors like feathery bottlenecks. Some got stuck. A few simply stared through the wire with quiet judgment. The legacy of the Emu War began to metastasize in new and unintended ways. In school textbooks, a single line was added under conflicts of the early 20th century, though often this line had been scribbled out by embarrassed local teachers. Private diaries, however, were more honest. One entry from a farmhand in Northam read simply, "I saw it again today. Just looking at me. They know." And yet, even in the wake of national defeat, there were those who saw in the emu not a foe, but a spirit guide. At least 2 travelling preachers began referring to the birds in sermons, likening them to Old Testament angels. One pamphlet asked, "Are you faster than the emu of sin?" The theological impact was limited, but the pamphlet made an excellent fire starter during a particularly cold month. In the military ranks, tales of the emu campaign became campfire lore. Veterans would speak of the bird that outran the truck, the one that dodged 39 shots, the pair that circled the camp in the dead of night like judgment made feather. Some of these stories were exaggerated, others were sadly true. One captain reportedly switched regiments just to escape the memories, and through it all the emus endured. They returned year after year, unbothered, uninvited, and unchanged. Their numbers swelled. Their gait remained lovely and sinister. It was said you could hear them in the early morning, thumping quietly across the horizon, like awkward sentinels of a forgotten truce. So while the war officially ended, the tension did not. Western Australians developed a mild twitch whenever ostriches were mentioned. Ornithologists began fielding suspiciously frequent questions about just how smart are birds really, and somewhere on a dusty patch of fencing near Woobin, a single sign appeared nailed to a post. It bore no words, just a picture of an emu wearing sunglasses. No one claimed it, but everyone understood. Of course, the end of open hostilities did not mean the end of emu-related problems. Far from it. With the army humiliated and the emus emboldened, Western Australia entered what might best be described as the uneasy truce phase of the war. Farmers returned to their fields with heads bowed and strategies downgraded. Machine guns were replaced by fencing, scarecrows, and one particularly ill-conceived attempt involving gramophones blaring recordings of distressed kangaroo calls. The emus, largely unmoved by audio drama, continued to treat freshly planted crops as their own personal buffet. One bird even developed a fondness for the scent of kerosene and took to napping beside fuel drums like a very flammable mascot. At this point, a new cast of characters drifted into the story like poorly cast extras in a slow-burning farce. Local governments, eager not to repeat the whole militarized clucking incident, turned to civilian marksmen. Thus entered Reginald Lefty Mason, an aspiring poet with only partial vision in one eye and an unusually gentle handshake. Lefty brought with him an antique hunting rifle, no formal training, and a moral code that forbade shooting anything facing away from him. No one, it seems, bothered to inform him that emus are almost always facing away. Still, he managed to fell exactly one bird over 3 days, after it tripped over his picnic basket and broke its own leg in an act of what Lefty described as mutual understanding. Meanwhile, the emus seemed to expand their territory as if casually redrawing maps. By early January, flocks were observed staging what appeared to be coordinated crossings of a newly constructed gravel road near Woobin. Eyewitness accounts from bewildered travellers noted that the lead birds paused as if checking for horses before nodding and ushering the rest through. One motorist swore he saw an emu look both ways, glance at the car, and proceed to cross anyway at a pace best described as emotionally indifferent. The wheat yields that season sagged under the weight of peck marks and crushed stalks. Local papers once again weighed in, their editors now embracing the absurdity with gusto. One editorial advised growers to plant decoy crops of millet and hope for divine intervention, or perhaps a fox with ambition. A letter to the editor from a Mrs. Jeanette Hollingworth suggested grooming the emus as draft animals, citing a dream she had in which an emu pulled her and her sister to market in a repurposed baby carriage. The dream ended reportedly when the emu insisted on stopping to eat fence posts. The letter concluded with a phrase now preserved in the archives of Australian surrealism. "My sister recommends rubber wheels." Back in Parliament, the topic of emu management became a minor but persistent irritation. Ministers debated solutions ranging from subsidising emu-resistant crops to encouraging settlers to develop a taste for giant bird meat. The problem, unfortunately, was that emus taste somewhat like old goat wrapped in rubbery bark. One chef in Perth attempted an emu terrine that sent 3 of his patrons into a brief but noticeable existential crisis. It was withdrawn from the menu with the vague warning that it was only for those at peace with failure. And then, quite unexpectedly, a new contender entered the field. Percy Turpentine, an amateur inventor with a fondness for brass tubing and Eastern mysticism. Percy unveiled what he called the harmonious emu channeler, a massive contraption of polished coils and vibrating rods designed to emit frequencies that would allegedly repel emus without harming them emotionally. No one was entirely sure how to test this, but Percy insisted the emus near his workshop had shown signs of existential doubt. 8 farmers pooled their winnings from a horse race and hired Percy for a 3-week trial. The machine ran for 4 days before a thunderstorm shorted it out and attracted every wombat within 50 kilometres. No emus were seen, but the wombats refused to leave for nearly a month and developed a fondness for classical music. Meanwhile, Lefty Mason, still armed with his antique rifle and deeply embroidered satchel, declared he was writing an epic poem about the Emu War. He claimed each stanza would correspond to a fallen fence post and that the final volume might require a second war to fill in the metaphors. A small printing press in Albany agreed to serialize it if the poem could be made less about birds and more about the universal search for belonging. Lefty agreed and added several verses involving the Greek concept of nostos and 6 different types of jam. By mid-year, the emus seemed to tire of the game, or perhaps they simply grew full or bored or moved on in pursuit of larger berries. Whatever the reason, their invasions lessened, their movements became erratic, and occasionally one was seen alone, wandering through townships with the melancholy amble of a faded actor waiting for a bus that never arrives. In the strange hush that followed, some residents reported feeling oddly bereft, as if the chaos had become a kind of background music, now conspicuously absent. One farmer claimed he had started leaving cornbread out by the fence post. Not because he missed them, he said, but because it felt polite. A statue commemorating the war was proposed but never built, owing to disputes over whether it should depict a soldier or an emu. A compromise sketch featured both, shaking hands, with the emu slightly taller and wearing a monocle. Historians generally agree this would have been deeply unhelpful, and yet the Emu War left its mark in other ways. A field guide to invasive large birds was published in 1934, featuring the phrase, "If chased, simply apologize and retreat slowly." A children's book called The Bird Who Conquered a Nation would go on to inspire 3 school plays and 1 deeply misunderstood puppet show, and in at least 1 rural bar a drink was concocted in honor of that feathered victory. Served in a tin mug with a ridiculous straw, It features equal parts rum, vinegar, and a mystery bitter labelled only as avian remorse. Do not ask what is in it. No one knows, not even the bartender, especially not the bartender. As the decades rolled calmly forward, the emus returned from legend to population statistics. But from time to time, particularly after the year's first strong rain, there are sightings of a strangely confident bird surveying old battlegrounds with something like smug nostalgia. Older farmers know to tip their hats, younger ones check their fences, and somewhere in the National Archives sits a memo marked urgent, dated November 1932, advising caution when underestimating fauna. It suggests patience, diplomacy, or very tall fences. The footnote underlines one word 3 times. It is simply, not again. And yet, as governments tend to do when embarrassed in public, Australia was not quite ready to admit total defeat. Following the Army's unfortunate withdrawal, the Ministry of Home Affairs issued a quiet directive to try something else, less public, less expensive, and ideally less humiliating. What followed was a sudden explosion of harebrained civilian-led countermeasures involving barbed wire fences, improvised scarecrows wearing borrowed police uniforms, and one particularly hopeful man in Narrogin who believed emus could be thwarted using jazz records and loudspeakers. His logic, though never fully explained, involved syncopation and spiritual disorientation. The emus, unaffected, trampled his Victrola and moved on. Farmers across the wheat belt devised their own strategies, most of them involving unpredictable mixtures of hope and household items. One enterprising woman in Merredin tried spraying her fields with eucalyptus oil, believing the birds would find the smell offensive. They did not. In fact, a number of them began nesting near her barn shortly afterward, apparently soothed by the spa-like atmosphere. Meanwhile, a retired circus strongman named Colin Boulder McGrath began training border collies to act as decoy emus, dressed in feathered tunics by his long-suffering wife Gertie. His plan was to lure real emus into traps using mission-trained imposters, but the dogs proved too good at bluffing and accidentally became local emu leaders, leading the birds in coordinated raids on oat storage bins. The press, unable to let this go, took renewed interest. Sydney newspapers ran breathless reports on the so-called dog-emu uprising, while a Melbourne columnist described the entire thing as a fever dream of British colonial delusion staged by unhinged avian revolutionaries. Editorial cartoons showed emus wearing monocles and top hats, holding parliamentary gavels and denying military subsidies to panicked farmers. One wag even proposed granting the birds a seat in Parliament on the grounds that they had already conquered more territory than some politicians ever managed to visit. Meanwhile, back in Canberra, the military high command had begun quietly scrubbing the emu war from official records, referring to it simply as Operation Grain Shield and hoping everyone would forget. But bureaucracy is not quick to learn from its own slapstick, and so, in early 1933, a new plan was floated from the Department of Agricultural Stability. This one involved trained marksmen hiding in fake trees. The trees, lovingly hand-carved from plywood and painted by unemployed stage decorators from a failed travelling opera company, looked more like haunted breadsticks than actual eucalyptus. The marksmen, for their part, suffered terribly from heat stroke and termites. An unlikely hero emerged in the form of Professor H.G. Minchin, a semi-retired zoologist who had written no fewer than 3 slightly inaccurate treatises on the behaviour of large flightless birds. Professor Minchin proposed a radical new approach, not war, but respect. He suggested constructing a vast emu preserve in central Western Australia, safely partitioned away from farmland by trenches, hedgerows, and what he termed psychological boundaries. When asked what that meant, Minchin produced a chart involving bird dream cycles and incense placement. Despite everything, the government approved half a grant, mostly because it sounded gentler than the previous attempts. Construction began immediately, overseen by a German landscape architect who'd recently lost a bet and had a personal vendetta against symmetry. Within weeks, the preserve featured spiralling ditches, irregular mounds, and a 12-foot perimeter wall topped with old radio aerials, which, according to Minchin, would emit discouraging vibrations. They did not, but the wall did occasionally attract lightning, which seemed to excite the emus immensely. Elsewhere the situation worsened. Some emus began nesting inside grain silos, having discovered the miracle of incline ladders. Farmers awoke to find small wooden planks placed against storage mounds, leading to piles of feathery intruders doing very little other than tilting their heads in unison and staring ominously. One farmer in Dumble Young claimed they were trying to learn arithmetic. Another swore they were spelling words using spilled freight labels. A third simply left them a bowl of water and stopped asking questions. By late 1933, with wheat prices crashing and dignity at an all-time low, Australia faced an inconvenient truth. Not only had the emus won, they had assimilated. They were no longer invaders of farmland, they were fixtures. Puffed-chested and unbothered, they sauntered through harvests as living, uninvited mascots. Children fed them crusts of bread on the way to school. A pub in Wagin erected a statue of one in a postal hat, claiming it once delivered a telegram between towns. It had not, but nobody wanted to ruin the story. In a final twist of bureaucratic surrender, the 1934 Federal Wildlife Management Memo referred to emus not as pests, but as rural adjuncts. The term meant nothing. It was a legal sigh. Still, it gave local councils just enough excuse to stop trying to eradicate them and instead build small benches along known emu paths where locals could sit and wait patiently while the birds skittered past, heedless of land tenure law. And so, after all the bullets, fences, flamenco records, plywood trees, and batty theories about incense, the great emu war faded not with a bang, but with a barely tolerated shuffle. Australia, undefeated in so many proper wars, had finally met its match in something barely sentient, but extremely fast. Perhaps the most enduring artefact of this whole episode can now be found in a dusty corner of the Perth Army Museum. Not a war medal, not a uniform patch, but a single slightly dented bugle with a tag that reads, "Recovered near Camp Feather, 1932. No one remembers who named the camp that way, but someone did, someone who knew a losing battle when they saw one. And so, after weeks of what could only loosely be described as combat, the Emu War fizzled into something closer to a truce, although one brokered entirely by frustration and low ammunition rather than any mutual understanding between man and bird. The military withdrew, presumably to lick its wounds and avoid eye contact with the press. The emus, on the other hand, returned to their regularly scheduled program of trampling wheat crops and peering blankly into the distance like feathered philosophers. Major Meredith, the commanding officer and reluctant architect of the Great Emu Campaign, reportedly spoke with a kind of tired reverence about the bird's resilience. He noted that even after taking multiple rounds, some emus continued to run, unbothered by the concept of mortality, or perhaps unaware it was even on the table. It was, in a way, the ultimate insult. Not only had the birds won, they had done so without ever acknowledging there was a war to begin with. Back in Canberra, bureaucrats quietly erased the operation from respectable conversation, and not one medal was awarded unless you count the moral victory earned by the emus, who have never seemed especially interested in ceremony. Parliament, in possession of neither a bird deterrent nor a good explanation, shifted blame to the farmers, the terrain, the weather, and, when pressed, possibly divine retribution. There was talk for a while about deploying planes or perhaps flamethrowers. One overly confident colonel is rumoured to have sent a memo titled "Aerial Bombardment of the Southeastern Flock," a modest proposal. It was rejected, though not for lack of enthusiasm, just a growing awareness that nothing good ever comes from declaring war on birds twice in the same decade. The risk of vengeance loops in the avian intelligence community was deemed too high. As the years went by, emu populations rose and fell quite on their own schedule. Farmers adapted. Some installed higher fences, others diversified their crops, and a few simply gave up and opened roadside emu-themed cafes. One such establishment, located near Campion where the fighting was heaviest, offered emu-shaped pancakes and included a small plaque on the wall with an etching of a boot, a bullet, and a feather. The caption read, "Never again." It remains unclear whether this was a promise or a threat. The emus, for their part, never pressed their advantage. They didn't organize, they didn't establish any kind of provisional bird government, and they didn't write memoirs. They just kept running, and occasionally stopping to tilt their heads at passing humans with what looked like mild disappointment. Whether that look meant anything specific, or was simply how emus are built to appear, remains a topic of zoological debate. There was no grand ceremony to mark the end of the conflict, no surrender letters, no statues erected, no national day of remembrance, just one particularly soggy October morning when the soldiers packed up their guns and left the wheat fields muddier than they had found them. The birds watched them go, possibly, or maybe they were looking in a completely different direction. Their eyes, after all, are not known for focus. To this day, the Great Emu War remains a strange footnote in military history, often mentioned alongside other noble disasters like Napoleon's invasion of Russia or the Maginot Line, but with more feathers and fewer maps. It serves as a cautionary tale, though what it cautions against is never entirely clear. Overconfidence, perhaps, or underestimating an opponent who has no goals, no tactics, and no concept of defeat. There was, incidentally, an informal suggestion at one point to classify the emus as a protected species, not out of ecological necessity, but as a preventive measure. The thinking was, if you cannot beat your enemy, maybe just convince everyone it's illegal to bother them. It is unclear whether this plan ever left committee, though it is tempting to imagine a group of stern legislators discussing Clause 4. Under no circumstances shall the emu be provoked. Today, you can still visit the area where all this occurred. The red soil is undisturbed in its disapproval, the wheat grows in steady defiance, and every so often An emu will lurch past the fence line with the blithe, unfocused ease of a creature that simply does not care who owns what. They are not fast exactly, but they are fast enough, which, it turns out, is all you really need. If you walk quietly through that terrain at dusk, when the light turns gold and the sky gives everything a soft apology, you might see one of them standing far off among the stalks, head high, neck like a coiled stick, an entire sack of confusion balanced on two dinosaur legs, and you might think to yourself, this is what beat us, this is who we lost to, and then, with the gentlest of thuds, it will disappear into the brush, victorious forever and completely unaware. Sweet dreams.